NASCAR champion Kyle Busch, his family revealing he died from severe pneumonia that then progressed into sepsis.
11 days. That is all the time that passed between a routine radio call at a road course in upstate New York and a joint statement from a grieving family, a race team, and an entire sport. 11 days between a driver asking his team to find a doctor and that same driver being gone. This is a story of how Kyle Busch spent the final stretch of his life, and the story Dale Earnhardt Jr. later told about the friendship the two men had only just rebuilt. On Thursday, May 21st, 2026, NASCAR, Richard Childress Racing, and the Busch family released a joint statement confirming that Kyle Busch had died at 41. He was a two-time Cup Series champion, the winningest driver in the history of NASCAR's top three national series with 234 victories, and for most of 2 decades, one of the most talked-about figures the sport has ever produced. Hours later, Dale Earnhardt Jr. posted something that reframed how fans understood the end of Kyle Busch's life. It was not a generic message of condolence. It was a story almost nobody outside their circle had heard. Earnhardt described their history plainly. The two of them had gone through, in his words, a genuinely difficult relationship for years. Anyone who followed NASCAR through the 2000s and 2010s already knew that much. Busch took over Earnhardt's old ride at Hendrick Motorsports after the 2007 season, when Rick Hendrick chose not to re-sign Busch specifically to make room for Earnhardt. Then came Richmond, where Busch clipped Earnhardt late in a battle for the win, and Junior Nation turned on him overnight. For years, Kyle Busch and Dale Earnhardt Jr. were shorthand for one of the pettiest, longest-running feuds in the garage. What Earnhardt revealed was that it was Busch, not him, who eventually closed the gap. According to Earnhardt, Busch walked into his motorhome one day and started talking, not about the past, but about how each of them ran their race teams as owners. That single conversation reset something between two men who had spent the better part of a decade making each other miserable. From there, Earnhardt said they even did media appearances together, laughing about the years of friction. Then came the detail that hit hardest. Earnhardt said the two of them had recently been discussing something new. Busch running one of Earnhardt's late model cars at North Wilkesboro that summer as part of the Cars Tour. According to later reporting, they had been texting about it as recently as the day before Busch died. Busch was planning to bring his seat over to Earnhardt's shop that Thursday for a fitting. He had reportedly told Earnhardt he wanted to run the number that Earnhardt already used, Earnhardt's own 8. And Earnhardt had told him that was exactly what was already on the car. Busch, by Earnhardt's account, seemed genuinely excited and had joked about the idea of Junior Nation and Kyle Busch's fans having to cheer for the same driver in the same race for once. That meeting was scheduled for Thursday, May 28th. Kyle Busch died on Thursday, May 21st, 1 week earlier, and a surprise started gone forward as planned roughly a week before what would have been one of the more unlikely feel-good storylines in recent NASCAR memory. Instead, one of the sport's more bitter modern rivalries ended not with a dramatic finish or a trophy, but with a seat fitting that never happened and a text thread that stopped. To understand how sudden this felt to people around Busch, you have to go back 11 days to Sunday, May 10th at Watkins Glen International in upstate New York. Busch was driving the number 8 Chevrolet for Richard Childress Racing in the Cup Series road course event. For a season that had, by his own admission, been a grind, this was a good day. He was running competitively, inside the top 10 late in the race. The kind of run that reminded people of the driver who terrorized Joe Gibbs Racing's rivals for over a decade. Late in the event, Busch keyed his radio and asked his team to track down a specific doctor, Bill Heisel of Ortho Carolina, saying he needed treatment after the race. When his spotter asked whether he wanted the doctor at the car or at his motorhome, Busch said the motorhome. The exchange went out live on the broadcast, and it was treated reasonably as nothing more than a driver managing a nagging sinus issue on a demanding road course. Watkins Glen's elevation changes and high cornering loads are brutal on anyone dealing with sinus pressure or congestion. Busch finished 8th, his best Cup finish of the season, and the moment passed without much comment. In hindsight, a few details stand out. Heisel is not a random trackside medic. He is NASCAR's most established motorsports physician, someone teams and drivers have relied on for well over a decade. A driver does not request him by name unless he already knows exactly who he needs. May 10th also happened to be the 4th birthday of Busch's daughter, Lennox, meaning that while his youngest child celebrated at home, her father was 2 states away, on the radio, asking for medical help after a race. Busch would go on to tell reporters days later that he still wasn't feeling right. The illness that would ultimately be identified, a case of pneumonia that progressed into sepsis, had already begun long before anyone around him grasped how serious it was. Whatever was building inside Busch's body, it didn't show up in his driving. On Friday, May 15th, at Dover Motor Speedway, Busch delivered one of the most dominant performances of his career in the Craftsman Truck Series. He won the pole, swept both stages, led the bulk of the race, and crossed the finish line comfortably ahead of Ty Majeski for his 234th career National Series win, a Truck Series victory that pushed his all-time record total to a mark that may stand for a very long time. Afterward, in an interview that has since taken on an entirely different weight, a reporter asked Busch why winning never seemed to get old for him. He said, in essence, that you take every win you can get because you never know which one will be your last. So you cherish all of them. Asked a similar question moments later in a separate press conversation, he repeated close to the same sentiment. It is worth being honest about context here. Veteran athletes say versions of this all the time. It's the sports cliche equivalent of, we take it one race at a time. Busch wasn't speaking with any private knowledge of what was coming. He was a driver reflecting on how much harder wins had become defined over a rough 2.5-year stretch in Cup competition. But watch back now with the benefit or burden of hindsight. Those comments land differently than they were ever meant to. The next day, Saturday, May 16th, Busch again told reporters he wasn't feeling great, describing a persistent cough. Nobody around him treated it as alarming. He'd just won the night before. Drivers race through colds and coughs constantly. It's part of the culture of the garage. That same normalization is part why what followed caught almost everyone off guard. The days that followed were, by every visible account, some of the most ordinary and happiest of Busch's final stretch. On Monday, May 18th, Busch's son Brexton turned 11. Busch posted a set of photos on Instagram tracing Brexton's childhood on racetracks and in victory lanes, writing about how proud he and his wife, Samantha, were the young man Brexton was becoming. It remains, as of this writing, the last post on Busch's Instagram account. Samantha posted her own tribute to their son that same day, describing him as driven, funny, and kind-hearted, and calling raising him one of the greatest gifts of her life. 3 days later, she would lose her husband. The words she wrote about her son that week now carry a very different kind of weight. The next day, Tuesday, May 19th, Busch and Brexton traveled to Durham, North Carolina, for the grand opening of an Andretti indoor karting facility, where NASCAR and IndyCar legend Mario Andretti was also in attendance. A witness at the event later told a local news outlet that he saw Busch and Brexton playing arcade games together, clearly enjoying themselves, and that he chose not to interrupt because the moment looked too personal to intrude on. Andretti himself would later describe seeing Busch smiling and shaking hands that day, calling the news of his death days later the shock of his life. Less than 24 hours after that afternoon at the arcade, Kyle Busch would be in medical distress on a bathroom floor in Concord, North Carolina. On Wednesday, May 20th, Busch drove to the General Motors Charlotte Technical Center in Concord for simulator work, an entirely routine part of a Cup driver's week, especially for Chevrolet teams like Richard Childress Racing that lean on that facility constantly for engineering and preparation. There was nothing unusual about him being there. At roughly 5:30 that evening, someone at the facility called 911. The Cabarrus County Sheriff's Office later released the audio. The caller told the dispatcher that a man was experiencing shortness of breath, was overheated, appeared close to passing out, and was coughing up blood while lying on a bathroom floor, but was still conscious. The caller repeated more than once that the man was awake and asked paramedics to approach without sirens, directing them to a side entrance. Busch was transported to a hospital in the Charlotte area. The specific hospital has not been publicly named. That call is the clearest public window into what was actually happening inside Busch's body in the hours before his death. Everything before it, the sinus cold at Watkins Glen, the request for a specific doctor, the lingering cough at Dover, reads in hindsight, like the early edges of something building for days. According to the death certificate later obtained by reporters, Busch had shown signs consistent with bacterial pneumonia for days to weeks before the infection progressed into sepsis, a life-threatening, whole-body response that the CDC describes as the immune system turning against its own tissue while trying to fight an infection. The certificate listed hemorrhagic shock and disseminated intravascular coagulation, complications of that sepsis, as contributing to his death. On Thursday morning, a statement went out from Busch's family and team describing a severe illness that had led to hospitalization and would keep him out of that weekend events at Charlotte Motor Speedway, including the Coca-Cola 600. Richard Childress Racing named Austin Hill as his replacement and said Busch's car would be waiting for him. Hours later, everything changed. The joint statement from the Busch family, NASCAR, and Richard Childress Racing confirmed that Kyle Busch had died. It described him as a future Hall of Famer and a talent who comes along once in a generation, and named his wife Samantha, his children Brexton and Lennox his parents, and his brother Kurt. 2 days later, on Saturday, May 23rd, the family released a follow-up statement with the medical explanation. Severe pneumonia had progressed into sepsis, causing rapid and overwhelming complications. They asked for continued privacy and understanding. NASCAR President Steve O'Donnell addressed reporters that weekend, describing Busch in blunt, affectionate terms and saying the sport would honor him by doing exactly what he loved, racing. When asked directly about cause of death at that first press conference before the family's formal statement, O'Donnell said only that they were barely a day removed from the news and that, out of respect for family, he wouldn't get into specifics, but promised more transparency would come. It did. 2 days later from the family itself. Richard Childress Racing also announced it would retire the number 8 indefinitely, saying Busch had helped shape that number's identity at RCR the way he had. The team said the number would be held in reserve for Brexton, should he choose to pursue a NASCAR career of his own, a decision that mirrors what RCR did with the number 3 after Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s death in 2001, holding it until Austin Dillon was ready to run it. The reactions from the garage came fast, and from almost everyone who had shared a track with him. Denny Hamlin, Busch's longtime Joe Gibbs racing teammate turned rival, called him one of the most gifted competitors he'd ever race against. Brad Keselowski described the news as an absolute shock and urged people to hold their loved ones close. Jimmy Johnson called him one of the most talented drivers he'd ever shared a garage with. William Byron credited him as one of the best mentors a young driver could ask for. Bubba Wallace described being unable to stop crying. Joe Gibbs Racing and Rick Hendrick, the two organizations most tied to his rise, both released statements describing him as family. Ahead of the Coca-Cola 600, NASCAR on Prime built a tribute video narrated by Dale Earnhardt Jr., tracing Busch's path from backyard go-karts too small for his feet to reach the pedals, through his rise as crew chief for his brother's team at age 10, to his first Truck Series start at 16, and on to a Truck Series win total that no one else in the sport's history has matched. Earnhardt closed by saying that whatever people thought Kyle Busch, and plenty of fans spent years booing him, he was also a father, a husband, a brother, a son, and, eventually, a friend of his own. In the immediate aftermath, one voice was conspicuously absent. Kurt Busch, Kyle's older brother, who had launched his own career 7 years ahead of him and once told reporters, back in 2001, that people hadn't seen anything yet compared to what his little brother could do. The Busch brothers went on to become one of NASCAR's most successful sibling pairings, combining for well over 90 Cup wins between them and remaining the only brothers each to reach 30 Cup victories individually. Kurt had been inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame in January 2026, only months before Kyle's death, with Kyle beside him for the occasion. For more than 2 weeks, Kurt said nothing publicly. Then on Monday, June 8th, he broke his silence with a lengthy post on Instagram. He thanked fans for the outpouring of support and looked back on a child who'd spent racing anything the two of them could get their hands on, from big wheels in the driveway to the biggest stages in motorsports. He wrote that he and Kyle had been more than fierce competitors. They had pushed each other, challenged each other, and learned from each other. No championship or trophy, he wrote, could measure what Kyle's passion and love for his family meant to the people around him. He closed by saying his heart was broken, but that he knew his brother's spirit would always ride with him, and signed off before words that fans and fellow drivers alike found impossible to read without feeling the weight of them. Rest easy, little brother. Samantha Busch, Kyle's wife of over a decade, spoke publicly as well in the weeks that followed, describing the love shown to her family as a source of comfort inside almost unbearable grief, and thanking the NASCAR community for honoring her husband in ways too numerous to count.